So this session is plazamania. When we started to announce this on social media, there was a little bit of a Twitter storm, if you like, with opponents of the Garden Bridge who gave us a lot of flack. Maybe some of you were in here tonight. But actually, the session's not really about the Garden Bridge, okay? We're not talking about one piece of architecture. It's about public space, what it is, what it means, why it's there, why we are in favor of it. Actually, it's very interesting to see that Thomas Heatherwick, who over 10 years has been the darling of British creativity and design and architecture, has got a lot of flack over this. I'm sure he's in hiding somewhere, shocked at the fact that people are giving him a hard time. So it's interesting to ask why. Why is he getting a hard time? Why is it that this discussion about public space has become a real issue? Not just the bridge, but the debate about public-private access and all these things. We want to dig a little bit deeper into this topic than just talk about a piece of architecture. And this is about public space, why there's lots of it about, but nobody seems to know why it's being provided. Public space is nice, as I would say. Public space is nice, but so is private space. So, why are we infatuated about this separation between secrecy, autonomy, individuality, and the idea to choose whether we want to be public individuals or whether we need to be private individuals within open space. So we're going to have 6 minutes presentation up here, and then we'll have a little bit of argy-bargy, and then we'll come out to you for questions. But if you want to make points, I think this has been the motive of the Battle of Ideas sessions. If you want to raise some points, make some observations of your own, challenge the panel, but also challenge the audience, then you're free to do so. So what we have here is a panel of some repute. Let me start. Jack Self on my left, an architect, writer based in London. He's contributing editor for the Architectural Review and author of Real Estate's Life Without Debt. He's just launched the Real Review, which is a new bi-monthly publication about architecture and spatial practice, not special, spatial. He founded Fulcrum, which is still the world's most read student publication about architecture. We then have Rowan. Rowan Moore is the architecture critic of The Observer on the far end. He was formerly director of the Architecture Foundation, architecture critic of the Evening Standard, and editor of Blueprint. He's the author of Why We Build. Last year, he was named Critic of the Year in the UK Press Awards, the first time an architectural writer has achieved that award, and well deserved. Alastair Donald, in the middle there, is director of the Future City Salon. He also manages the British Council's architecture programme and co-commissioner for the British Pavilion at the Venice International Architecture Biennale. He oversees strategy and programming for the new British Inventors campaign in Asia. And actually, he's been travelling around for the last 6 months, organising the Thomas Heatherwick exhibition as the one remaining British export industry. He writes widely on architecture, etc. You get the picture. Okay, 6 minutes. Jack, crack on.
I want to suggest that the Garden Bridge is representative of a state of civil war in London. And the reason I say this, and what I mean by civil war, is as follows. The Garden Bridge really, I'm sure you've heard of the plans to redevelop the North Bank between Embankment and Blackfriars. This is going to be called North Bank. It's a kind of mirror to South Bank, except in as much as South Bank has always been, since the 1950s, imagined as a place for high culture and popular activities to mix together, the North Bank will be for private development and luxury apartments and everything we've come to love about London today. And the Garden Bridge really, therefore, is key to uniting the footfall and traffic between the currently inaccessible region of the North Bank, divided by the Victoria Embankment Road, and the South Bank, where currently all the guys are. So the logic behind the Garden Bridge is really one of economic growth. It's really about profit. What is economic growth, and why are we designing our cities around it? Well, as many of you will know, if you've studied architecture or have an interest in it, economics is often described as coming from the Greek word oikos, which means household. And as architects, we often think that economics and the space of the house are interconnected. But actually, it doesn't really refer to the house itself. It refers to the household, or really the clan, or the family interest. And in the Greek city, civilization was not a given. It was a very tenuous thing. And it was only achieved when politics, which was the interests of the polis, which was the interests of everyone who lived in the city, were able to triumph over economics, which was described as the interests of the households, of the clans. So in a way, there was this constant struggle for civilization in Greek cities, which was really trying to always triumph over private individual interest in order to be able to achieve civilization through politics and through city interest. The word for civil war in ancient Greek was therefore stasis, and stasis really described the moment at which the interests of individuals and of the household triumphed over politics or the interests of everyone. And what I want to suggest is that the emergence of projects like the Garden Bridge, even if the Garden Bridge itself is not successful, it's indicative of an entire attitude which preferences the interests of what might today, economics is tied up with the corporation, and therefore the clan interests are really those of the corporate. It's the domination of the interests of private corporations over the interests of the general populace. And this, in a sense, I want to bring up at this point one of the questions on the list, which was, what is the public? Well, of course, the public is not, sometimes we think of the public as like just a group of people that live in a city, but the public is a very specific type of group. It's really the people. And the people is a political concept. It's not like the multitude, which is just the crowd. The people and the public constitute themselves in our society through representative democratic institutions in order to decide together or to pass on their representation to a body in order that we can decide on what our common interests are. And that's why I say that the Garden Bridge is really a sign of civil war in our city, in the sense that we've reached a kind of stasis. It's very difficult to see how we can move forward as a society when the interests of the people are subsumed below the interests of private corporations.
Yeah. Stick that in your pipe. Good. A little bit of Greek. Always goes down well. Rowan, if you would, please.
Okay, I'm not going to do Greek. I'm going to refer you to a well-known publication, Neue Zeitung, which was a periodical published in Breslau in the 19th century, and I'm going to cite a report from June 1855. And I'm sorry if you've heard this one before. Anyway, so their reporter from London announced that posters had gone all around the city, announcing there will be an open-air meeting of artisans, workers, and the lower orders generally, which will take place in Hyde Park on Sunday afternoon to see how religiously the aristocracy is observing the Sabbath. This was all about a Sunday trading bill proposed by someone called Lord Robert Grosvenor, who his family still owns a lot of land in London. And the idea was to stop people shopping and drinking on Sundays. And as of that time, working people worked 6 days a week and Sunday was their only day off. This was a very unpopular measure, to which Lord Robert Grosvenor said it was perfectly fair because, in his words, the aristocracy was largely refraining from employing its servants and horses on Sundays. So that made it fine if people who worked couldn't ever shop or drink. However, there were other people who disagreed, and the correspondent for Neue Zeitung, who was in fact called Karl Marx, went on to report that 200,000 people went to the place where English high society parade their magnificent horses and carriages with all their trappings, followed by swarms of lackeys. So you had all these people with carriages and their servants, and then you had 200,000 people protesting for the right to enjoy their Sundays. There were speeches, insults, some fighting, the police got involved. According to a later report, the police acted with excessive violence on people who hadn't actually caused any violence themselves. 11 years later, 1866, there was another demonstration in Hyde Park in favour of universal male suffrage, the right for all men to have the vote. That time there was a fence around the park and they knocked it down. There was another protest, and the Times complained that it is against all reason and all justice that motley crowds from all parts of the metropolis should take possession of Hyde Park and interfere with the enjoyments of those to whom the park more particularly belongs. So that's a very interesting line. So there's an idea that at that point in the 19th century, Hyde Park belongs to one group of people who are in fact, the sort of better off, posher people, and it doesn't belong to anybody else who should stay away from it. However, the upshot of these protests was that Hyde Park became the place that it has more or less been since, which is essentially a place where anyone can go, all sorts of things can happen. You are allowed to make political protests, although you're supposed to do it in Speaker's Corner, which is a sort of weird, forgotten spot. And then there was a kind of victory for acquiring the park for a kind of wider public. There are other examples from the 19th century of this sort of transformation from private to public space. All those Georgian estates like Bloomsbury, Belgravia, that are so widely admired, were in fact gated estates. You couldn't go into them unless you had some business there, until the 19th century, when there were campaigns to open them up, led by, among other things, the Daily Telegraph. So this was a subject on which the Daily Telegraph and Karl Marx were fundamentally in agreement. And there was also the movement to preserve the commons, which were the areas of green space where there were kind of historic rights to graze sheep and gather furs for putting on your roof and gather firewood and so on, which had sort of become less relevant. So the people who owned this land wanted to enclose it, build on it, and they were very rigorously opposed, to which we owe the existence of places like Hampstead Heath. So although people didn't want to gather furs anymore, they did want to go for walks and so on. So now we're in a time when people are getting kind of rather nervous and worried about what's happening to public space. You have examples like the Sky Garden on top of the walkie-talkie, which is this sort of glassed over restaurant with some plants around it, which is described as a public space. And people like me get a bit nervous about this because it doesn't really seem to be very public to us. Or there's Paternoster Square next to St. Paul's Cathedral, which is the subject of about 15 years of debate, mostly about its architectural style, all through which many different proposals, architects' plans, etc., different developers coming and going, they all said, we are making a public space outside the cathedral. Then 2011, Occupy movement turns up. They see this thing that looks like a public space. They want to put their tents there. And a sign goes up saying, Paternoster Square is private land. Any license to the public to enter or cross this land is revoked forthwith. There is no implied or express permission to enter the premises or any part. Any such entry will constitute a trespass. So this thing that was public up to this point suddenly becomes private. So they put their tents up outside the cathedral instead. So the question is, why does this matter? It's not any longer a matter of livelihoods, of grazing sheep, gathering firewood. Because I'm out of time, I will leave this as a question, but I would suggest it's about a certain kind of freedom, a certain ability to make your own space in a city that isn't kind of scripted and programmed for you by whoever might own it.
Thank you very much. Alastair.
I don't think that privatisation, these issues on access, on ownership, I just don't think they're the main issue that we face in cities today. And it's really interesting that you mention Occupy, actually, because I think the Occupy situation at St. Paul's in 2011-12 highlights a really interesting paradox about the current discussion, because amidst the fury of protesters and supporters who are bemoaning the privatisation of public space, the Corporation of London, not opening it up to the public. What was very interesting was that the Occupy movement themselves developed what they called a safer spaces policy for the space in front of St. Paul's Cathedral. And you can still find this on the internet, actually. And to do this, what the safer spaces policy that they developed was, they developed 13 guidelines, 13 behavioural rules that you had to submit to in order to be within this space. So there are things like, just to give a couple of examples, respect each other's physical and emotional boundaries, always get explicit verbal consent before touching someone. There was a ban on alcohol and drugs. And there was also this idea that if someone violates the rules, then they can ask for what they called a mediation process. So it's kind of really interesting that here we have a campaign against privatisation, but at the same time the promotion of a whole new set of rules and regulations that actually govern the interaction between people in public space. And, you know, those rules and regulations kind of something that the product of a nightmare encounter between a sort of human resources department, a student union and a local authority petty bureaucrat. I mean, that's the sort of rules and regulations that those Occupy rules, I think, represented. And I think these are not just the Occupy rules and regulations, but they're indicative of a wider set of rules that society is developing and has been developing over the past decade or so that operate within public space. So take one of the rules which kind of typify the Occupy approach: respect each other's physical and emotional boundaries. And I think what's interesting here, and, you know, again, I think this is a generalized trend, is the way that the idea of freedom is understood and effectively actually reconceived. So it shifts freedom from being something that's demanded, I think in the way that Jack was maybe talking about in the early part of his speech, something that's demanded by a collective within the city, a kind of freedom for us to act as autonomous citizens. It transforms that into actually a freedom that's handed down and actually is a freedom from interference from other people. So it's kind of, you keep away from me because you might invade my space kind of thing. And that's the sort of sense that I'm getting recently of how public space is operating through this kind of plethora of new rules. That might be, you know, the bans on leafleting and busking, which is kind of saying we're not adult enough to kind of deal with those things in public space, or smoking and drinking, or the kind of proposals floated just in the election time on the Corbyn Labour leadership election time of separating out women into separate tube trains. You know, it's as if we're not adult enough anymore to be able to deal with the potential hazards of public space. So just two kind of quick examples of the way that this is working. And for Londoners, anybody who knows Brixton, if you've ever been down to the redesign of Brixton Central Square, according to the designers, Gross Max, what they were designing was something that responded to the fact that, and this is kind of more or less quoting them, the traditional pillars of society, such as the church, town hall and the library are no longer a priority for such civic space. And instead, there's this kind of new agenda of program and event, whatever that means, planned to provide opposite experiences such as enclosure and opening, the introvert and the extrovert, an integrated park and square for both bio and cultural diversity. And kind of you think, well, no wonder it's such a soulless place, because you realize from that kind of gobbledygook that I think society no longer kind of understands and has a clue about the values that it actually stands for. So it's no wonder in a sense that there's kind of, without these kind of traditional notions of what civic space is for, it's no wonder that urban designers respond in a fairly crass way. And what takes over, and I think again you find this in the justifications for a lot of public space just now, is that they're cleaner. That becomes something to celebrate, that they promote walking, they have a hierarchy of movement, and they're safe, which doesn't actually anymore even mean designing out crime itself. It means designing something that promotes a feeling of safety, that kind of cocoons us within this sort of feeling of safety, which arguably actually is not a city value at all. I mean, if there's one good thing about cities, it's that they tend to be kind of unsettling places. And so I'll just leave it at the one example, but just to finish off, I think kind of what we're seeing here is almost a complete transformation in the notion of what it means to be civic today. So if you go back to the Renaissance and the idea of virtue, then you had the idea that individuals were about justice, wisdom, temperance, fortitude. You've got quite grand sounding, quite old fashioned sounding virtues that had the ability to kind of transcend your individual experience. I think today though, what we're celebrating really is the kind of values of safety, of health, the kind of really inward, self-centered, almost narcissistic values that have kind of no ability to transcend your individual experience into a kind of wider public experience. And that's one of the problems of public space just now, that we've kind of lost the reason to design it.
Very good. Ancient Greece, bit of Karl Marx, Renaissance. Ponder on some questions, okay? So don't let them flannel you. If you think that they've said things that you don't agree with, please take the opportunity to come back. But let me ask a couple of questions just to hopefully flag things up. Can I start with you, Jack? In terms of your Greek, my Greek isn't as good as yours, but if stasis once meant civil war, it doesn't mean that now, does it? And I was wondering which interpretation of stasis you were talking about, because if you say that the Garden Bridge debate is a symbol of civil war, I see stasis in society, and it's an incredibly passive society in which we work, and there's a lot of kind of Twitters and letters going back and forth. But are you really saying this is some kind of massive civil engagement in a positive sense?
In a negative sense.
Okay.
I mean, I think what we've seen from the kind of history which has been elaborated by the other two speakers is that, beginning with the Renaissance and the Enlightenment and really reaching its pinnacle during the Victorian times, is this success of politics, of publicness, and of democracy. And it was, it took 300 years to develop, and it's taken 40 years to demolish. And so the reason at the Garden Bridge and the reason, stasis, the Greeks didn't have a concept, unlike the Victorians, of social and technological progress, which means that in the age we live today, we're obsessed by new technology because we think it's going to improve our lives and improve us as people. So we have the vision that society is getting better as we go forward. You look at the Holocaust, you look at Rwanda, you look at the current migrant crisis which is occurring in Europe, and I think it's pretty clear that, newer versions of iPhones do not equal higher levels of social morality. Therefore, what stasis really means is the impossibility of civilization and of governance and of democracy when the interests of the private overcome the idea of politics. And what I would suggest is that we're living in a period in which we basically have seen, it's almost a cliche to say it, but the end of politics. I don't think that it's really fundamentally a problem of democracy rather than a problem of economics, because there was an economic argument that was made at the end of the 70s and early 80s in which it was said economics is now going to be the driving force of our society. And what did it do? It killed politics. And now we end up in a situation in which the reason we end up with forms of public space which talk about personal responsibility, which talks about the rights of the individual to feel safe or to, and so on. This is all basically because we can no longer as a group agree, as you pointed out, Alastair, what our political priorities are, in the sense of what the values are and what the ambitions and aspirations that we all share as a society and as a polis, as a city, are. So, for me, it's, to bring up Corbyn as a concluding remark, there was a very interesting editorial in The Economist the week before Corbyn was elected, which said, if Corbyn is elected, it's going to be terrible for democracy because he is going to take control of a party where he'll occupy the marginal fringe of politics, which will mean that the opposition in our parliament will break down. And since our two-party model depends on a robust opposition to hold the government to account, we're going to end up living in a society where there's just one party, like a communist China. And I thought, if the election of one individual as the leader of a political party can destabilize the entire democratic process of this country, then it is the democratic process itself which is flawed and not the election of the individual. And therefore, that's what I would suggest, that these types of projects like the Garden Bridge are indicative of a paradigmatic failure of politics in Western society at large and in Britain in particular.
Sorry, when you say the democratic process is at fault rather than the individual, are you then suggesting there's a problem with the democratic process of democracy itself?
Sure. It's the corpse that no one really wants to touch, because especially in the wake of the war on terror, in which democracy was, made into this extremely fragile yet golden, value that no one could question. And the truth is, we live in a world in which people can express their preferences. And they were about to get a dislike button on Facebook, so you'll be able to see exactly how instantly. But it's not a facile point. You can see instantly what your response and what your engagement in a public forum is. When someone makes a comment, you can see instantly how many people like and dislike it, how popular it is. And so people have, I think now, they also have much more diverse opinions, and they're not really prepared to vote en bloc with one party where they may not agree with everything. And I think that the old ideas, the form of democracy we have today was really developed in the 19th century in order to give voice to the masses. Well, now the masses have the technology and the ability to express very complex and nuanced opinions, but the democratic model has failed to keep up with that.
Right, Rowan.
Yeah.
Obviously, coming to this discussion of the Garden Bridge being a point of civil war, but then comparing it with your Marxist analysis, obviously we see the fundamental difference between agents and active agency and the role of the mass. But in terms of your where you went with that, in terms of public space, the reason that we held this discussion was actually because of Daniel Moylan arguing that there is lots of public space around, but A, if it's owned by private companies, then why shouldn't they tell people what to do and get off my land? And B, that there's far too much public space. Everybody now designing a building puts a large area of concrete in front of it and calls it a public plaza, and is somehow ticking the box of civic engagement. So what do you?
Well, I'd actually have some sympathy with both those points. Okay, to deal with the second one, this idea that there's a kind of obligation for sort of authorities or developers to kind of make public space is, as a sort of self-evident truth, is very questionable. I think making public space is a very difficult thing to do from a sort of in a top-down way. And an awful lot of the most successful public spaces have happened half by accident, or else they were created by some higher authority, some monarch or whatever in the past, and have been appropriated and kind of remade by a wider public, which is what happened with Hyde Park, which was in fact a royal hunting park once upon a time. And so this idea you have to go around kind of manufacturing public space is questionable, and it very often doesn't work because it's a very elusive thing, and you can make a public space and then people don't come to it, and then you have to sort of invent lots of programs. So I have sympathy with that. I also have sympathy with the idea that you can have privately owned space, land in a city, to which people have different degrees of access, and in fact there's no platonic ideal of public space. There's no such thing as a space that's absolutely equally available to everyone, because depending on where a place is, for one thing, makes a difference about kind of what sort of audience it's for. There's a difference between a park in London and a park in Sunderland, just because it's in a different place. And then you have things like pubs, railway stations, museums, all these places which have different degrees of sort of publicness, ownership, control. There's a lot of criticism of the fact that Garden Bridge closes at night, which shows we can come on to whether that's right or not. But on the other hand, museums close at night. A lot of genuinely public parks close at night. So these boundaries are not absolute. However, what I think is really important is when there is potentially a kind of diminution of what we already have above all else. When you have a way of living in the city that has certain freedoms that go with it, certain opportunities, and those get shrunk, commoditized, reduced. I think that's what the argument's really about. But also, I do think if you have an expanding population, as we do, the question of, do we sometimes actually need to create more shared space for this expanding population, I think is also a reasonable question to ask.
And shared space, public space,
Well, I prefer the word shared space, actually, because I think this sort of fetishization of actually kind of public space, quote unquote, can be a bit dangerous.
Okay, good. Alastair, come to you. In terms of your Occupy movement example, I don't want to put words in Jack's mouth, but in terms of the fact that the Occupy movement take over this area and they lay down some ground rules and they write a 13-point plan, the fact that you don't like it and you parody it with some ideas about "don't touch me." In some ways, what Jack was saying is that there's an active civil war. Maybe there's a need to recreate the public. Yes, it's a level of stasis that we've reached, and we need to recreate the public. If that was actually a stage of trying to do it, one model that you might not like, but maybe that's the point about creating a public, is that we all may disagree with it, and we all then may be engaged in really creating it. Would you then be less inclined to criticize them? The fact that you don't like it is neither here nor there. They're actually trying to reinvent the public.
Well, it wasn't parodying it; it was quoting it actually. So that's not true. The accusation, I mean, yes, in a way, we do need to recreate the public, I think, and it's important to think about how that may happen, and it probably would involve individuals getting together and collectively working out the set of circumstances and the set of informal rules by which they negotiate and which they relate to each other. I mean, that in a sense is how the autonomous individual, if you like, becomes a member of a collective public, is going through that working out process. But that's not what Occupy was about. And I think what it was responding to was a set of circumstances in society where we've become inherently fearful of how we relate to other people. And we try to, in effect, build these mechanisms into our interactions with other people that almost kind of insulate us and isolate us individually from other people. And that's what the Occupy movement expressed. I think in terms of the recreation of the notion of the public, first of all, I think what Rowan was talking about in terms of talking about a public, I would call it a public realm or public sphere, I think, rather than public space. But I think that's a useful way of thinking about it because it gets beyond the kind of technicalities and ownership of public space into something that I think has a much more kind of social dynamic and is much more productive way of discussing things. And again, I think Jack usefully sort of talks about things like democracy, which again, I think would be a useful thing to argue for in the recreation of a public. But I think the thing about that is that where we are just now is not arguing for more democracy, but actually quite scared of democracy. And the whole Corbyn thing, to me, the thing about it wasn't that that whole conservative reaction of he gets elected, that fearful reaction to Corbyn was kind of mad in a way. It was just ludicrous. But the thing about Corbyn is, and the reason why he's bad for democracy in a sense, is that he offers no alternative. He was the guy that in some ways invented the politics of behaviour. He was one of the first people that talked about the need for smoking bans. He buys into that whole new Labour thing of the politics of behaviour. So that's not a reinvention of democracy in the public. That's kind of it's stopping that happen.
Right, look, you don't have to be serfs to my aristocracy. You don't have to pander to my questions. If you have anything you want to say in response to what's been said, then have a...
Yeah, I want to make one really quick point, which is about kind of the difference between shared space and public space and even the public realm. And I want to suggest that, and I thought it was very interesting kind of examples where we talk about museums and train stations, and in many ways, to come back to this idea of politics as the pursuit of common interest, a lot of these spaces exist because of we have an excuse to be there because of our common interests, because of our interest in having freedom of movement around the country or internationally, because we want to have, freedom to enjoy the natural environment in other ways, and often and even enjoy our culture, and in the case of institutes like the British Museum, the cultures of others who we've managed to appropriate. But in a way, this idea of the public realm as being the domain or the kingdom that belongs to, in which the king, if you want, or the monarch is the people, is all of us, I think is a very good way of thinking about this, and a good way of distinguishing between, the question of ownership is a lot less important than whether or not the space or the function of the space, whether it's a building or an open ground, serves our common interest. And that's why I bring up the question about democracy and how we decide what our common interest is. But I also suggest that in reformulating the public, let's make a proposition. How do we reconstitute or bring back this phoenix from the ashes, which is the public? And I would suggest that actually one of the most important elements of this is public housing. Because public housing, irrespective of the model of tenure or the form of occupation and ownership, when people have a safe place to reside and they have a decent common standard of living, it already puts them, first of all, a huge excuse in order to occupy a space. They also have a huge common interest in the maintenance and prosperity of that space. And in a way, I would suggest that the housing crisis and the inability for us to live together with each other in places that we enjoy or feel invested in has a huge part to do with the decline of the public as a whole.
And that's public provision of public housing.
It's got to do fundamentally with just the supply, sufficient supply, whether that comes from a private sector that's incentivized or whether that comes from a public initiative.
All right. Anybody else on points that's been raised?
Well, I mean, the housing, it's also to do with the way it's managed and sort of with the way joint decisions are made, which also has some relation to the built form, though not an absolute one. I mean, not necessarily the case. I mean, I'd say, there definitely have been examples of social housing where the publicness of them has been flawed, where things have been created sort of in the name of being public that haven't worked, where you've had the form of the public, but you haven't had the actuality of it, which is to do with possibly kind of over mighty municipal power at a certain point.
Personally, I wonder whether we're just shifting the
let's go back
public
to
housing is
Yeah,
the solution.
I think that's entirely true. That's just an extension of the ownership. The question: does public space serve common interest? I mean, that is it's a kind of technical question again about public space as is housing. I mean, the way we arrive at a housing solution might be the product of a political debate, but the actual provision of housing is merely just the provision of housing, I think. So I think the question that's really being avoided here is the question of the public, which seems to me that necessarily must come first before the public space. It's how do we reconstitute ourselves as a public, and I just. I think the change over the past 30 years in the way that we think about the public has been enormous, and the way we act in public space. And the changes are not the product of anything to do with changes in space. They're much more to do with changes in the social conditions. Just as an example, if I think back to when I was growing up and late teens, early 20s in Scotland, and the way that something like New Year operated. You basically made your own entertainment at New Year. You kind of, you went round neighbours' houses, you kind of gathered in whatever space was available. There was a kind of self-generating mechanism to the kind of how the public came alive on that night of the year. What's particularly striking, I think, is the way that you look at these occasions now. It happens in Scotland, it happens in London, as it happens as well, which is that all of these things now have to be formally organised. So Edinburgh, where I used to go for New Year fairly regularly, now has a cordon around it where you've got to buy a ticket in advance to get through the cordon, and there's kind of all these bands and what have you. So the expectation is that there's a formality to how you behave as a public. And I think it's completely stripped out the kind of self-generating mechanisms of how we are as individuals and how we interact with people that makes what I would call, what I think is a more reasonable idea of the public.
Okay. I thought you were going to say at Christmas time in Scotland you went around people's houses and stole your presents. Right, so no anecdotes about your early life, childhood or anything like that. Can we have some questions or positions, if you want, for the panel?
Just to get back to Renaissance and your definition of civic concepts, you were appealing to us sort of reaching above and maybe being a little bit imaginative than just worrying about health and jobs. But if you go back to Renaissance, the probably most representative picture of Renaissance is Ambrogetti with the governance of good and bad cities. Yes. And it's a very simple, you keep the city safe, the jobs will come, people building houses, job done. You don't do that, it's a disaster. So I think the kind of uplifting stuff maybe came a lot later. I think city is very, very simple. But if you look at the simplicity, one thing which I was observing on the debate of public space, it was a debate which was completely hijacked by the biking mafia, which refused to accept the fact that you can't take the bike or something like that. It was ridiculous. It was nothing to do with the fact that that bridge was a wonderful green idea for people to walk with the kids from one side where the school is to where they actually live. That was all lost in the debate that you couldn't take the bloody bike through. So I'm just sort of highlighting it that at the moment the city debate, particularly in London, is being hijacked by very vocal groups, but the groups that don't actually live in the city. They live online, they play games 24 4x7. We just have to find a way of debating public space for people who use it.
I'd like to start with an anecdote from my early life, which is that when I was about 5 years old, my dad took me to see the Christmas tree in Trafalgar Square, and I immediately started to climb on whatever it was that was holding the thing up, and the policeman came and stopped that from happening, and my dad got in an argument with the police about civil liberties, and it was really embarrassing. I don't think you can possibly define public space as space where you can do whatever you want. And that's a really, I think, a false benchmark of public space. Of course you can't camp next to St. Paul's. It was just a really quite a sort of ridiculous thing to do, to try to create a shanty town next to St. Paul's. And also, in effect, privatise it. I mean, I after it had dragged on for weeks and weeks, I started to feel quite indignant. I thought, who are these people stopping me from enjoying my public space? Get out of here. So I think that's not a helpful thing. When you go to Spain, it's quite clear what public space is for. It's for behaving publicly. So you go out in the evening and everyone's having calamaris and ice cream. The children are playing rowdily, but not too rowdily. The adults are drinking, but not too rowdily. And people just know what to do. They just behave in a public fashion. That's what public space is for. And it's just not a big sort of hang-up. So this is where I was there when the Garden Bridge was conceived. I'm a former member of Heatherwick Studio, and I just failed to recognise this bridge from your description, Jack. It's so far from being a moneyed interest. It was two quite crazy English eccentrics got together in a room and dreamed up this very eccentric and odd and problematic, I do believe, project. But I just failed to recognise your description, maybe because it was mostly in Greek. It didn't help at all. I couldn't really get to grips with that. But it really is not whatever you choose to project your own preoccupations upon this project like a mirror, that is not what is happening there. There was never any talk about the North Bank being an economic whatever. There are hundreds of projects up and down this land that are privatised, and this is just not one of them. It's not privatised because it doesn't exist. You can't privatise something that exists. It's being made. So I'm also speaking as a protester to do with Mount Pleasant, where the space being made really was going to be privatised. And that's a complete mess. It's another whole rant. But what was very clear was that nobody, including the Quango called Create Streets, has the first clue how to create a space that might be public.
I think public space is a misleading term. What you need to think about more is civic space, space for interaction. And that's inherently unlike what you say, I think. It's a positive idea, not necessarily wholly a negative idea. You've got to construct something there as well. Most of the public spaces that are being constructed in London at the moment, as has been pointed out, are fairly lame. They're at the top of buildings. There are concrete slabs in front. But that's not the biggest problem. The problem is that these spaces are inherently important for our survival as humanity. Sounds bold, okay. But we have to learn to work together because increasingly problems we're being faced with are collective action problems where we have to have social interactions in order to debate, in order to solve them. Environmental problems, problems of demographic change. These are problems of value. If you look at, there's a well-known study that shows how in small remote communities and islands, in forests and things like that, people have very different ways of fundamental values. When a load of economists and behavioral economists went together and made them play certain games, like you have $1, split it between the person in front of you and yourself. They can't see you, and you just can get what you get. So I could say, oh, I'll just take all the $1 and walk away, and they'll never know it was me that did it, and they'll just get that no $1. But there are some communities in which people give 70, 80, 90% of the $1 to the person who's never even going to know they gave it to them. There are really different fundamental micro behaviors that can be spurred by these spaces. So we have to make and then that springs back to the last thing I'll say, to the London kind of governance sphere, where public space, civic space, is being constructed at various stages. You were saying you can't just manufacture it, but you can usher it into being. Spaces that already exist do need governance to push them into some sort of positive societal activity. You need some sort of coherent plan that allows actors, whether it's businesses, developers, the GLA, whoever it is, to develop these spaces together, because that's the reality of it.
As far as who the thwarted revolutionaries of the Occupy movement were, it is me. I was very heavily involved with the Occupy movement. My student publication did 10 weekly publications, or editions. I spent several nights at St. Paul's. I was there on the first day. I read that sign that you mentioned. And actually the failure of the Occupy movement basically made me completely disillusioned with the concept of protest, and I've never been on another protest. Physical occupation of a space and governance and management of space no longer really correlated to each other. And so in a way, occupying that space didn't really have any profound impact on the space itself, although it did have many other political ramifications. However, the point that I wanted to make is that there are 2 points very quickly. The first is that there's been some discussion of civic and of good civic governance in particular, which is an incredible mural. And thank you for mentioning that. Actually, it's reminded me of something else. But, this really relates back to civitas, which is not the same as democracy or the public, because civitas has to do with, and even actually to do with political elitism. The citizen, which is the manifestation of the civitas.
Who says bloody civitas?
Sorry, what was the civic?
Civitas.
Sorry. The civic, which is manifested by the citizen, has to do basically with the conception where Rome invents the idea of the capital city. And they do that in order to impose their will upon places which they decide don't have the status of cities. So they would conquer cities, or Marseille, for example, or they would go and build cities out in the countryside, which they called urbs. And therefore, actually, the citizen is really someone who has it's a group of elite people who have a very specific interest in controlling the city. And therefore, I'm not sure to what extent that civic is necessarily historically the best term for discussing. And as you say, it's about the governance of the economic and material wealth of the individuals in order to prevent being overthrown. And that idea of the avoidance of the collapse of society is, I'm not sure, necessarily the right starting point for building a positive vision. And the other thing, just to conclude about the bridge, I take your point to the woman at the back. I take your point completely that it may not have been at any point part of the conception of the project, or the idea of economic growth and uniting two regions. I completely take that. However, I think it would be wrong to think that that's not the product of the project, or that it didn't figure in someone's mind explicitly or implicitly at some point, because the entire history of infrastructure is the history of the increase of land value, the increase of speculative value of property. And you look at what the Metro, TfL did, or Transport for London did in Metro land at the start of the 20th century, and the extension of tube lines has always been basically gone hand in hand with economic growth and of property speculation. And so one has to ask the question that if it was not about economic growth, and if that piece of urban infrastructure was not about augmenting the economic value on both sides of the river, what actually, I mean, is it just about kind of a pedestrian crossing, in which case, one can imagine many other ways of doing that without creating a bridge underwritten by the state and underwritten by taxpayers' money? If it was a truly private venture, that shouldn't have ever been on the table. And alternatively, one can imagine, that if it's about providing green space, there are already many areas which could be open for conversion or rehabilitation without, again, having to build a piece of urban infrastructure.
Can I just...
Even I want to argue with you, but... Rowan.
I mean, just on a point of fact, a somewhat belated study was commissioned to make the business case for the Garden Bridge, kind of after the fact, but they kind of had to do this to justify the public expenditure. They had to prove its value for money. And one of the main arguments was that it would increase property values on the north bank of the Thames.
Yeah, but this is the Commission for Architecture and the Built Environment. They started this, didn't they? That then, any development needs to meet these 10 criteria of health, well-being, increasing value.
And this was a kind of reasonable bit of due diligence, but the argument they chose to use, because there wasn't actually any other business economic argument for it, was that it would increase values on the north bank of the Thames, which you would have thought, well, is that a place that needs its values being increased? So that does to reinforce what you're saying.
But is it part of the fact that nobody argues for social improvement anymore?
Well, yes. Yeah, that everything has to be sort of monetized, and which actually also goes to what someone was saying about cycling, which is there's a kind of functionalist justification for public space. You can't you know, it's very difficult to justify it just for itself. So either it has to be kind of like good for business, has to increase property values, it has to perform a transport function, or it has to serve a very well-defined and vocal group, which at a certain point begins to run against what public space is, because the whole point is that it's where more than one kind of group can exist together. And yes, then you start having these justifications. It's for, you know, people are going to be healthier, people are going to have less heart disease, etc., which is sort of what you're talking about. And the real virtue of it is something much more elusive than that, but that's very hard to describe and therefore defend.
One extremely very quick. That may well be the case. Of course, the flip side of two eccentrics who decide that they want to, presumably as an act of public philanthropy, build a bridge across the Thames, would seem to me to be like wholly undemocratic. And I don't know if I want to live in a society in which two eccentrics.
I think there's more than two, but anyway.
Well, if it was initiated by two people, I don't know to what extent the private interest has the right to construct public space.
Well, there's also a way in which kind of eccentricity can be a sort of camouflage for other things to happen. Because I believe...
The history of innovation was eccentrics, but there you go.
I mean, I believe Joanna Lumley's good faith. I believe she's a nice person and she wants to do something nice. But you're ending up with a situation where you're going to have this phenomenally expensive piece of equipment costing public money. And if it's going to happen, it's going to require a very large amount of money from, I don't know, the government of Qatar or something like that. Some sort of very wealthy private sponsor. And, you know, there's no free lunch. They're not going to just give that sort of money away and not ask for anything back in terms of like favourable planning laws or something that is in their interest. So, so no, it all starts with a lovely person, Joanna Lumley, and you end up with, you know, very big sums of money changing hands with sort of questionable agendas.
All right.
Well, on the Garden Bridge, I'm not going to be able to avoid it by the looks of it. The discussion in response to the Garden Bridge over the last year has been considerably more interesting and more telling than the Garden Bridge itself as a bit of infrastructure and a bit of design. And to me, you know, several things seem to be reflective of that discussion. One is that the public are broadly supportive of it, but generally kind of fairly not engaged with it, which is kind of architecture in general these days. I think is indicative of that. The second thing is how much attention a group of NIMBYists get on the south bank of the Thames. And I mean, you know, we used to, you know, anybody who thought of themselves as reasonably progressive in the way that cities were going to be built in the future kind of had it in for NIMBYists a bit. They were the kind of people that stopped things being built. But now we suddenly seem to be in a situation where we're celebrating these kind of stop the bridge going ahead, kind of small town, small-minded parochial attitudes. So it's kind of quite interesting that that's acquired a kind of positive connotation. The third thing is that it seems to me the kind of press attitude to it really speaks of a tabloidization of the press, who scurry around now for the latest bit of scandal rather than write architectural critiques, which Rowan does very well actually to still get into the Observer. But broadly speaking, the architectural press slowly is shifting away from. And finally, you know, the procurement thing I just find really interesting, because if there's one thing that's been destructive of architecture over the past 10, 15, 20 years, it's the current set of public procurement rules, which stifle any way of kind of smaller niche architects and people who do interesting things of actually getting them built. But now, we're all of a sudden, everybody's all over the procurement process, holding it up as an example of something to celebrate and that should be obeyed. So I just think that the whole discussion is indicative of a very negative moment in architecture generally, as opposed to something about the Garden Bridge.
All right. Once we start talking about procurement, you know you're in trouble. Right. Very last round, I'm afraid. Time's against us. We'll take some short questions and then you can address the point and make your final big kind of big moment.
Just one point on the Occupy movement. One of the reasons, which I think was a scandal for a lot of us, was that St. Paul's Cathedral shut its doors. The church used to be a public space. The nave of all Christian churches in England were public. Only the sanctuary was and the sanctuary rail was originally to prevent dogs entering the sanctuary. The fact is that the nave of all churches was the public space. It was where the market was, where the village went in time of war or difficulty. For St. Paul's Cathedral to shut what a lot of Londoners thought was a public space. The fact is actually it costs, is it £20 to go into St. Paul's Cathedral, and it's free to go into Tate Modern, just across the Wobbly Bridge, is something ironic. Interesting, there's going to be, I think, another great debate about the work, of the role of public and private within this building. Sir Simon Rattle is about to become, next year, the music director of the London Symphony Orchestra, which is housed in this building. But Sir Simon has said one of the only reasons why he accepted the position was that the government would commit in principle to building him a concert hall, which will cost at least £300 million. He went to see George Osborne, and George Osborne has agreed in principle to put public money. It will be put in the old Museum of London site when Museum of London moves to Spitalfields, to West Smithfield. Do we really need a fourth concert hall in this great city? Or, okay, they're all not as perfect as Sir Simon had in Berlin. But the idea that we are now cruising quietly to a 300 or 400 million concert hall, literally run by the Barbican, but within 5 minutes from the concert hall, which is next door, is, I think, will make the Garden Bridge debate look like a children's tea party.
Thank you very much.
Could I just react to that?
No.
Really suddenly, because I've been quite not involved in it, but I'm a person from Birmingham who's seen every concert Simon Rattle did. And in Birmingham, we have an exemplary concert hall, a wonderful hall. And I can't understand why London, the greatest city on earth, shouldn't have at least an equally good concert hall. And I really think that if it's 300 million, it'd be 300 million very well spent. And I'd far prefer that to the Garden Bridge.
To get back to public's, the idea of the public, the Institute of Ideas had a whole 4-day session on the public, and anytime anybody talks about speaking for the public, you better think about it like they're speaking on behalf of God, don't believe them. And so I wanted to go back to the political side of space, public space, and people's lack of engagement. I think that you should talk to Bill Durode from the Asymmetric Warfare and the New Terrorism talk earlier, because we're just missing this. We're not engaging people in the right ways, or we're not getting to people, so they go to Syria. And I don't know, I just thought that'd be interesting. You said you gave up on the Occupy movement, but a lot of people are giving up on political engagement in this country as well.
Okay, thank you.
I don't like the Garden Bridge because it's horrible, horrible design, and it's really badly put together. The reason that we are clinging on to the NIMBYs and the procurement process is because that seems to be the only way to stop this piece of crap appearing on our river. It's not because we have some sort of veneration of NIMBYs all of a sudden. I want to push you, Alastair, on your kind of position in general in this. I am also someone who is alarmed about the erosion of public liberty and public space, but I am baffled by your analysis of Occupy, essentially, because you talk nostalgically about civic space and about liberty and about freedom, but then you get very miserable about Occupy's decision to make up some rules when they took over a piece of space. And that feels a little bit hypocritical to me. And aren't you just doing exactly what the lady at the back is doing and saying that you can have public space as long as you behave in it in a public fashion, whatever that means? Frankly, I can't think of anything more dull than public space in which one is constrained to behaving in a public manner.
At the risk of parodying some of the points, I don't really recognise the kind of contestation between a really robust public sphere and a really robust private sphere. So some of those historical examples, I'm not sure how relevant they are now. To me, it seems much more about trying to produce a public through the use of space, and a particular kind of public based on a particular set of principles. So if you look at a lot of regeneration of London, things like Museum Road, Kensington High Street, and the bridge is a good example of this. They're built on very specific principles about mingling of traffic, promotion of walking. So it really is about trying to create values within people, I think, and trying to create a public rather than there being a pre-existing public.
Cool. That's your lot. Thank you very much. Jack, do you want to give it some?
I mean, if you think that you look like you're about the same age as me, then probably you will recognize this kind of expression like apathetic generation or political apathy amongst. When I was growing up, I was told that I was very politically apathetic. And I think it's very interesting to see a lot of studies which show that actually it's not apathy, it's like disinterest and despair. And I think it's there is no alternative. It's a lack of alternative which makes us give up on politics, which leads to extremism. I would agree with that point, rather than necessarily being like a unwillingness to engage with public space. I think the point about production of space is also extremely important and a very interesting it would be very interesting to bring back into the public sphere the discussions that were really geographical discussions, particularly from the 60s and 70s, Henri Lefebvre and his kind of descendants that talk about the way in which we produce subjectivity through the space. You're given a space with a clear set of rules and therefore you behave according to them. I guess the sort of final thing on the Occupy movement, what happened was I didn't become disillusioned with the possibility. First of all, I would say about the occupation and the closure of the church, I completely agree with that. And I think that, the idea of sanctum and the idea that this is a space of true freedom and of protection, divine protection, is an extremely important one. And we should, in a way, be considering how the concept of divine protection in a society which is no longer theocratic, but which is democratic, and i.e. no longer ruled by God, but ruled by the people, what the equivalent of a secular sanctuary might be in the city, might be one way of thinking of it. And yeah, I wasn't disillusioned with the idea of social dissidence or protest. I just recognized, or at least I decided for myself, that I would put that effort into thinking about how we can redesign the architectural office itself and how we can redesign the role of the architect in society in order to try and achieve through spatial ends, but not through physical occupation, the same types of goals that I still have.
Thank you very much, Rowan.
I just want to come back to this thing about, partly kind of this idea of rules. Because of course, you do have to have some rules in any public space. You just have the laws of the land to some extent, and you do want certain kinds of behaviour are fine and certain are not in different places. You don't want people to have complete freedom to be utterly obnoxious, whatever. I also think that there's a kind of tendency to, when you start talking about public space and the public, you start pictures come into the head of sort of happy citizens in medieval Siena or whatever it is, and people having sort of parties and doing very collective public things together. But one of the most important freedoms of public space is the freedom to be on your own, or in a couple, or in a small group. To be actually more alone in a park than you might be in your own home, especially if you've got 20 people living there and increasingly overcrowded conditions. So I just put that out there, that there's a sort of, it's possible to kind of have a sort of Disney idea of public space, or a sort of sentimental idea that you just have to check against.
Good, thank you.
I really agree with that, actually. I think that's a really important point. And I think it's a reflection of what we are, because we're private individuals. That's what we are in public space, and we become a public collective through joining the private individuals together. So we should have a space to be alone and to opt out, in a way, of kind of all the things that we're asked to do within public space. And I just, to come to the point up here, I thought I was arguing, maybe I didn't get it across very clearly, but I thought I was arguing that in the face of the recent encroachment of all sorts of rules and regulations, fairly petty rules and regulations, things like smoke, you can't smoke anymore in public space, or you're starting to see a clampdown on smoking in public space, drinking, you get arrested, fined for spittings in some places just now, you can't crack open a tin in a beer on the tube. You can't leaflet in many town centres. So in response to all of that, what I was asserting was that we should be free people should be free to do these things, and we should be free to tell them to naff off if that's what we kind of want to do. But nevertheless, that's the kind of contest of the city, and we kind of need to reassert that we have a level of tolerance that accepts all these things, because the cities are reasonably ambiguous places. And my only point on Occupy was that I see it as an extension of those petty rules and regulations, not an alternative. It's dressed up in a trendy sort of left-wing language, but it's nevertheless an extension of the same process of kind of the kind of proceduralism that goes with public space these days. And I think it's kind of, we do well to argue for autonomy and for freedom instead of that. Two quick last final points. One on the kind of good governance, good bad governance. I can't say how tragic I think it is that you reduce one of the great paintings of the Renaissance to jobs and housing. I mean, Jesus Christ. The flourishing, the re-flourishing of society in these kind of 13th, 14th, 15th centuries, and you reduce it to jobs and housing. So I think it's much more than that. But I just want to finish on the final point up here, a question from the last round, but one about the kind of the need for the GLA and all sorts of bodies to kind of reassert public space through these these endless initiatives, the mayor designing 100 squares and all of that. And I just think I think we should resist it. I think it's got to the point where public spaces is become a problem with all of this. I think we should resist it, go from Brixton Square, recreated under the Mayor's project, to Brixton High Street, where public life really happens, which is the process of negotiating a city space.
Thank you very much. Well, even though some people talk too much, it was still very rewarding. And what was really good about this is this was a pseudo agreement, but actually quite nuanced disagreement. And I thought it was actually added more to the debate and the depth of debate for that. So can we have a round of applause, please, for the panelists?